and distribute it to whoever the demand is, or where the customers are. For this to happen, we need a piece of technology that doesn't exist yet, and it's called the supernode. In practical terms, the supergrid will operate on the basis of hundreds of these supernodes, linking generation in a meshed grid and connecting up with the distribution systems on a continental scale. A model of this supernode has been developed in our company, and along with some help from the Dublin Institute of Technology, and this is it here. This is the first time we're presenting this. This is capable of handling 2,500 megawatts of direct current. That would be about a 1 to 150 scale, I think. That should be about the size of the playing fields at Croke Park. And this is actually quite a proud thing for me, because not only do we have to think up what this supergrid was, but how do you actually make it work as a real electricity trading system? And the guys who, anybody has any questions on this, we have Joe Corbett here who'll be delighted to explain the detail of how it works. Anyway, we'll be showing this at the Delors Institute and in Beijing and in Brussels as well. So prices drive markets, and markets can stimulate innovation whenever it's allowed to operate free from distortion. We in Mainstream are ahead of the curve in that we believe the transition from fossils to renewables is inevitable, and that big grids are essential, and that the supernode is indispensable. We're responding to the future by becoming first movers in the technology that will be absolutely fundamental to the electricity era ahead. And I call the era that's in front of us the enhanced era for electricity. And we believe that gradually electricity will replace many of the forms of fundamental energy that we have today. Similar developments are essential in building utility-grade storage capacity. Allied to distributed car batteries, we need to actually have a lot of, things the size of this building based on chemicals which will store electricity and even out the variability in wind and in solar. The trend in patent applications proves that business is anticipating fundamental change in the generation, distribution, sale and storage of electricity, and it's interesting that China leads the league table in the number of patent applications. From the perspective of stimulating entrepreneurship, all that's needed now is the right price signal to be given. The other big advantage associated with carbon pricing arises from the logic of carbon pricing. If the price is sufficiently high to induce real change, then economies will put on the same price path, and carbon prices will tend to bunch together over time. So we'll actually get a convergence. As a result, a global price range will emerge which will be broadly neutral in terms of its effects on national economies, and will neither penalise nor benefit any particular economy. There will be no big winners and no big losers, except those who bet on a fossil fuel future. On the other hand, the perceived absence of neutrality is a political weakness in the COP form of negotiations. Invariably, it produces winners and losers, and has up to now. Governments seek to protect their own self-interest, and the problem with intergovernmental negotiations is that the parties are never equal in terms of negotiating power. That is the cloud hanging over the COP process, and we believe that carbon pricing, it dispenses it, does away with it. In addition to the economic advantages I've just outlined, carbon pricing also has a number of political strengths as a negotiating framework. It gets us away from the failed intergovernmental approach in which diplomats try to work out a global agreement as to which country should do what in terms of reductions. That was the approach taken at COP19 in Copenhagen, and by common consent it was regarded as a disastrous failure and a diplomatic disaster. COP20 has given little hope for progress. I think that happened in Poland. And it's no surprise that the expectations for next year's COP21 are low in some quarters. Now, Einstein is supposed to have said that madness consists in trying the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result each time. So it's a good rule in life that more of the same will probably produce more of the same. Bilateral and even multilateral burden sharing has been proved not to work. So let's get on with the global agreement. Otherwise, temperatures will keep on rising. Carbon pricing would get us away from a failed approach and open the door to progress by changing the context for devising a solution. It was Monet who advised that the way to find a solution to a political problem is to change the context. He didn't believe in the madness of sticking to failed formulae. The second political advantage arises from the fact that world opinion is actually moving in the direction of carbon pricing. Since it's always a good negotiating rule to reinforce the positive and build on what is common, let us concentrate on what unites instead of focusing on what divides. And what unites the world community is the common threat caused by burning fossil fuels. This has produced at least three encouraging developments. One, at the international level, the World Bank has explicitly called for greater international cooperation in bringing forward carbon pricing policies and for strengthening them where they already exist. It has issued a draft statement on the 5th of this month entitled Putting a Price on Carbon, in which it says that the latest report from the IPCC makes clear the importance of putting a price on carbon to help limit the increase in global mean temperature to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Secondly, the impetus for carbon pricing has been further strengthened by the UN Secretary-General's decision to convene a climate summit this September to build what he calls a solid foundation for successful negotiations on reducing emissions. Using unusual language for an international diplomat, he has challenged world leaders to come to the summit with bold pledges and concrete action that will close the emissions gap. The summit is not to be part of the current negotiating process. Rather, what he's trying to do is to create a cultural climate in which we can bring about this change we're referring to. So carbon pricing fits in with the latest international thinking on how to get progress on climate change. But the strongest political argument in favour of carbon pricing is that it aligns with a series of measures recently taken by the Chinese government. The most significant initiative is the introduction of a cap-and-trade scheme on an experimental basis in 5 cities and in 2 regions in China, which account for 30% of the country's emissions. First started in Shenzhen last year, and it's of profound significance because it means that the Chinese authorities have chosen a cap-and-trade scheme as their preferred policy instrument for reducing emissions. Those who have studied China have a further reason for regarding this move as significant. They know that an experimental approach is the way China always prepares for a major shift in economic policy. It is their unique planning methodology, an example of which is their special economic zones. The Chinese authorities have indicated they will apply the lessons of these experiments to the whole of the economy by the end of next year, which incidentally would coincide with the opening of COP21. That expectation should be taken at face value because it follows from a long period of policy gestation. As far back as the 10th five-year plan, the Chinese authorities signalled their concerns about environmental damage, and in the current plan, they developed ambitious measures to combat climate change. Preparatory work on the 13th five-year plan indicates that this will be one of the top priorities for China over the next 3 to 4 decades. As I said in previous lectures here, the Chinese planning system is unique in terms of the way it mobilises the collective intelligence of that great society and applies it to devising and implementing long-term development strategies. For example, China set out on a path to a renewables future and by 2008 had become the world's largest solar panel producer and the largest producer of wind towers. Today it produces approximately 25% of the wind turbine rotor blades. According to the US Energy Information Administration, the EIA, China is the world's largest and fastest growing market for renewables, with a cumulative capacity of 91,400 megawatts of wind installed and 20,300 megawatts of solar installed. And this is confirmation of its economic capacity to deliver on political commitment. Putting it simply, if the Chinese authorities decide on a course of action and commit themselves to stated goals, it should be accepted that the necessary resources will be mobilised and that the goals will be achieved. And that is what history tells us. But let's say that there are some delays in introducing a national scheme, a cap-and-trade scheme. That's not important. What is important is that China has chosen its pathway to a low-carbon economy. Since it is already the world's largest economy as measured in terms of purchasing power parity. That decision has created an irreversible momentum in favour of emission trading schemes. According to the World Bank, countries operating cap-and-trade schemes already cover 22% of world emissions, and that figure will rise to over 50% when they are joined by China. Even the US would have to, and I believe is, taking note. And this is more than wishful thinking about the United States, I'm happy to say. Because Americans distrust international organisations and don't like outsiders telling them what to do, it follows that warnings about climate change have to come from insiders in the United States itself if they're to be taken seriously. That's why the Climate Assessment Report, just published by the US government, is so important. It sets out a state-by-state examination of the damage being inflicted by climate change on the people and on the economy of the United States. And it looks to a future and speculates as to what will happen under a business-as-usual scenario. And it's an alarming prognosis of widespread devastation and got a lot of media coverage. And then NASA held a press conference on expert reports confirming the urgency of the IPCC findings, which you've all been reading about recently. Because its credibility is so high and media reaction was extensive, in particular reflecting the growing public concern of the threat posed by rising sea levels to coastal cities such as New York, New Orleans, Miami, Tampa and Boston, to name but 5 of the most vulnerable cities. That concern has been heightened by the huge losses of the Western Antarctic ice shelf and by the realisation that no matter what we do, in a recent article by Michael E. Mann in Scientific American, he pointed out that if we stop putting up another tonne of carbon into the atmosphere, we've already locked in 1.5 metres of sea rise. Now, didn't say when this is going to happen, but it's absolutely now inevitable. And that explains why President Obama has indicated he may take executive action on reducing emissions if Congress fails to act. And this is great to see that his ability to do this has been challenged in the Supreme Court of the United States, and by a judgment of 4-3, the Supreme Court found that he was entitled to use the EPA Act of 1972, introduced by Nixon, to actually introduce a tax on carbon. They said, the Supreme Court of the United States said carbon is a pollutant and you can act to combat it. So the United States is in a different frame of mind than it was when under President Clinton, Al Gore negotiated the Kyoto Agreement. And this has been confirmed by the climate change talks going on in Washington between the United States and China, which one of the Chinese negotiators described as making good progress. And of course, this process is helped by John Kerry, the Secretary of State's commitment to combating climate change. As things stand now, the world community can be separated into 4 groups on reducing carbon emissions: those that have already introduced a cap-and-trade scheme, such as the EU, those that are proposing to introduce one, such as China, those who are waiting for a lead and would most likely follow the majority, and this would include most of the developing world, and finally those who have yet to take a position. These are the refuseniks, to quote Reagan, such as the United States, the coal users and the oil producers. If the first 2 groups were to come to a joint position, that would account for over half of the world's carbon emissions. And were they to agree on using an emission trading scheme as the way to reduce emissions, then they would have created a de facto global carbon price, which others could follow. There's a consensus within Europe. Well, actually, this is an important technical detail. How much should a tonne of carbon dioxide cost? In the research that I've done on the Chinese economy, they reckon that 23 euros per tonne of carbon dioxide would actually change human behaviour. I've heard the IEI say, that's the International Energy Agency, say that a price of $45 would be needed. But actually those figures aren't too far apart. If we're talking about some figure like